This is Debrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Welcome to Debrief, the podcast that explains industry to policymakers and government policy to industry, and is driven by the Australian Industry Group's mission, which is to empower industry success for a better Australia. My name is Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy at the Australian Industry Group. And this week, I'm back to usual programming, and I'm joined by Head of Research and Economics, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson. Welcome, Jeff.
Hi, Louise. How you going?
Now, today we're going to cover two big topics, the first being our latest trade and supply chains report that was released on Monday. And the second half will cover a high-level summary of our submission to the House Standing Committee for Education, Building Australia's Asia Capability Inquiry. But before we get into that, Jeff, let's cover a topic that's triggering to both you and I, and that's the discussion around Australia's rating on the Complexity Index. You go first, and then I'll give my 2 cents.
For those who are listening, there's something called the Harvard Economic Complexity Index, and it measures how many different products a country exports. So some countries, a country that just exports one thing, and you could imagine some like tropical producers in Africa, they have a very low score because they only maybe jute or sugar. Other countries, say Germany, lots of different kinds of machine parts, a very high score. Australia has forever gotten a very low score on this because our export basket has a lot of iron ore, a lot of coal, a lot of gas, and a lot of education in it for products. Every time a new edition comes out, there's the national hand-wringing about, we're falling behind and we're a backwards country and all of this stuff. And it drives us, it drives those who measure economic statistics insane for reasons I think Louise is about to jump in on.
Well, we could. So it's really a percentage of our exports. So people are worried because, particularly those in the manufacturing advocacy space, I don't know. I should have not looked up the data before I pointed this, but very small percentage of our exports are elaborately transformed manufacturers because the bulk of our exports are those big things, iron ore, coal, etc. And I often think, well, yes, we could improve that percentage if we reduced all those iron ore exports, but we'd be so broke we probably wouldn't have any other industry, and we certainly wouldn't have NDIS or all the other things that we rely on. And mining is not the problem here. In fact, and the other issue that I get angry about is people confuse complexity of product with complexity of process. So while, yes, iron ore, raw minerals are not particularly complex products, the way we do it in Australia is incredibly technology intensive, knowledge intensive. And that's one of the reasons why when China tried to bully us with economic coercion, they could stop our lobsters, but they weren't able to stop any of our minerals because at the moment, no one else in the world is doing it with such level of technology and efficiency as we are.
And it's a good thing as well. Like a lot of the most Industry 4 and plus industrial technology in Australia initially comes into the mining industry because it's capital intensive. It's making a lot of money. It can afford to put that in. We're seeing this here in WA where, for remote sensing Rio Tinto runs a lot of its mines from a command centre at Perth Airport, 3,000 kilometres away. But that created a whole skilled workforce of people that can do remote sensing that then spilled over after the mining boom into the agriculture sector for monitoring water in remote places of Australia. So if we shut down that industry, our complexity score would go up, but we'd be missing $100 billion of exports, and we wouldn't be able to use that to bring a whole lot of other capabilities into the country that can spill over in lots of clever ways. So next time you see Harvard Complexity Index, Economic Complexity Index on LinkedIn, don't click the link. Don't do it.
And the thing is, without that Rio Tinto site that you mentioned, we wouldn't be thinking about mining from the moon, and we wouldn't have the AI and cybersecurity industry that has really been driven by WA. Not that I'm an apologist for WA, but a lot of that technology in Australia is coming from there.
Well, not only could we mine on the moon with that technology, but we could mine from the moon. Once you have that's internet connected, people operating mines and choosing which ore face to drill from and mix. Once you dislocate it from a site, this is all. But what's in automation does is it breaks geography, right? It would be very hard to say that this is a bad thing for the country, or indeed bad for manufacturing.
Exactly, because that's the reason why manufacturing in WA is growing up, is because they're feeding into that huge complex. But we've got so much to talk about. And one thing about mining that everyone, particularly manufacturing, is excited about is critical minerals, which of course, was discussed and agreed to in the recent Albanese-Trump meeting. There's a lot of coverage on that. We don't need to go into great depth. I will just say, though, that the sigh of relief from DFAT on how well it went, I think, could power a small town. I mean, they were really on edge. And I think when Albanese's in Malaysia next week for the ASEAN meetings and then probably Korea for APEC, there will be more than one country sidling up to him saying, well, how did you get away with not being shamed and embarrassed in that meeting? But the critical minerals.
The answer might be have critical minerals and run a trade deficit with the US, I suspect were the answers, which
Yes.
not everyone in the region has these natural advantages that we do with Trump angling. But
No, and the Australian took up our report ahead of that meeting, and it was beating the drum about tariffs. We didn't get any change in tariffs, and we have the lowest tariffs. But it's actually, from your report, Jeff, it's not the actual tariffs, the 10% that's hitting Australia, or 50% for our metals industry. It's actually the uncertainty that it's creating across the whole world. Tell me how it's reshaping the landscape for Australian exporters and manufacturers. And are there any particular sectors that are feeling the greatest impact?
So just for some background, we did a big survey of industrial companies in Australia in July and August this year, and to look at how 6 months in after this Trump trade shock, how's that turning up in Australian industry? Look, the national focus, and if you read the newspaper article, it's really focused on that Australian exports to the US, which we know are really dominated by elaborately transformed manufacturers. About a third of our ETMs go to the US, and they're facing anything between a 10 to a 50% tariff, depending on how much metal's included in a product. And so that's what everyone has kind of just said. For industry, this is a manufacturer's metals problem. If you don't export metal containing stuff to the US, you're probably okay. We went out to industry and asked them this question. And the answers we got were quite different, because that tariff is kind of the first order effect. But as they've been imposed, and not just on Australia, but on lots of other countries, I mean, China it's been suspended temporarily, but there was a 145% tariff announced on China at one point through this process. And it's caused a lot of chaos in supply chains. Our members have reported to us a couple of problems. One is supply chain disruptions, because when all of that, it's just like COVID over again. When one link in the supply chain gets interrupted by a tariff, there's knock-on effects back down the line. Another one we have seen from some is trade diversion, when products from other countries that were destined for the US can't go to the US because of the tariff anymore. It's uneconomic to send them there, and they end up somewhere else. And Australia, with low tariff rates in our country, were a good place for that to go. But the biggest one, and this is reported by about half of Australian industrials, was an uncertainty or a chilling effect on investment. And what we've seen in globalized industries is a lot of big companies that run these haven't been willing to invest over the last 6 months. Trump's announced tariffs, he's put high ones, then there's a negotiation to bring some down. New products are getting added all the time. We had upholstered furniture last month. And so everyone's just saying we want to see where all of this Trump policy settings land before we make those big capital investment decisions as to where we're going to put the next factory, where we're going to put the next distribution centre, where we're going to do our logistics through. We just don't know how to make investments that go for 5 or 10 years when we don't even know what trade policy is going to look like in 5 to 10 days with Trump. And this has meant global investments in industrial sectors as kind of everyone's just gotten out of the pool for a little while till it settles down. But the problem is no big global investment, that's new orders turning up. So if there's no big works being built, that's not doing first round of orders, second round of orders, third round of orders. And we've had many of our companies that don't export to the US and don't have a tariff-protected product saying orders have just dried up for my elaborately transformed manufacture because there's this uncertainty effect of no one's investing until we see where this all washes out.
Well, a lot of those ETMs are capital equipment. And as you say, capital investment, if you're spending $500,000 to $1 million, even if you're willing to, your banker may not be as ambitious as you and may put a stop to it. So it is, as I say, it's that particular category of product is particularly vulnerable to this sort of uncertainty and investment freezing. Fast-moving consumables, a different story and can probably push through, but these decisions are easily delayed. For a moment. I mean, a year on, they won't be able to delay them much longer. They'll need to still reinvest.
Well, and for a big global industrial conglomerate, you can kind of sit out of the pool for a year. But particularly for Australia's advanced manufacturing industry, which are often small or probably medium companies, you can think of 50 to 100 employees, right? They're not necessarily going to be able to just tell the bank to go away until Trump's calmed down, right? Like this is, that short-term disappearance is a big burden. And the other one that's really hurting, I'm back to abundance here, Louise. I'm sorry on the podcast. Abundance is back. It's compliance burden. A lot of the new US tariffs have been applied in a way that just don't conform to existing ways that we've done trade for decades about certificates of origin and bills of lading and content declarations. They've made up a whole new set of systems for how they're going to implement these tariffs. And that's been applied to the trading companies who, by grey tape, then have to knock it back. So we've seen about a third of our members say, we just have to, even if our trade's unaffected, the paperwork and compliance burden for the unaffected trade has gone up because our supplier's thinking, well, your product might be going to a product that might end up in the US, so you have to fill out all these forms of exactly where the 2% of steel in the product, where did that steel come from, and that's flown down. So there is also, which, again, large industrial conglomerates, it's the cost of doing business for a small business that was used to filling out a 2-page form, having to fill out a 25-page form, because maybe their thing might maybe one day be part of something that ends up in the US and there might be a tariff. It's just an additional thing to be able to participate in global supply chains in those high value niche areas for small and medium businesses in Australia.
And supply chain shocks now seems to be ongoing. It's just wave upon wave. But I think this is a little bit different to the COVID shock and supply chain. And I think what's interesting about this survey is not just, how much are you hurting or are you hurting, but we actually ask what are the strategies we're employing to address this. And people hearing about that paperwork, I'm sure are thinking, oh, can't AI sort all that out? is there a role?
Can't do everything yet. Like, can we just AI that? Yeah.
I was just writing a brief for Ines and I wrote the line, AI is not magic. Anyway, what are the strategies? Like, are they investing in technology? Is there AI? Are they friendshoring? What strategy are they using these days?
What's interesting is we did say, what are you doing about all of this? And about half of Australian manufacturers, or just under 42% of Australian manufacturers, saying that they're going to increase their investments in their supply chain next year, which is a good strategy. This is them saying, okay, this is becoming a problem. It's a challenge. We're going to commit more resources to getting this right. We also looked in, and for those who want, you can read the report on the AL Group website. We also looked in on, what are you investing in, was our next question. And the number one thing, Louise, was digital logistics tech. So things like enterprise resource planning systems, a lot of I4 technologies you'd see on the shop floor, remote sensing, quantity. I know Louise loves the box counting AI robot that you can use to do inventory rather than having someone check it all off by hand. The robot takes a photo of the pile of boxes and says that's 642 units there or something. Warehouse capacity and AI, machine learning and automation. So if this is going to be a catalyst for a big tech push in Australian industry, because if you have to document that stuff, you have to get your compliance right. And you need to know exactly how much steel is in your product, because that component's going to cop a tariff in the US. So the amount of supply chain information on your suppliers and customers that you're going to need to succeed in this new environment is going to be much higher. And we see the businesses they're getting it, they're putting the money down. This is a good thing. It'd be even better if they didn't have to do it. If we were doing it for efficiency, productivity reasons, not just to run through the gauntlet of this Trump's trade madness, but never waste a crisis.
That's right. I mean, while it may not, may have sped up investment or triggered that, force people to the table, the outcome should be positive, because I think the ideal with digital supply chains is that rather than constantly reacting and responding to shocks, you can in some way predict and then prepare. And some of the AI work that we're doing with members, they are doing that. They are looking at prospective inventory requirements and demand and adjusting their production. So it is getting there, but look, I always think, I don't want to be too Pollyanna-ish, but some good, as you say, does come from a crisis, and perhaps digitalising supply chains will be key to that.
Well, as we like to say, is Australian manufacturers are pretty robust. They export globally. Australia has no tariff protection, low to no subsidy rates. Pretty much every other major economy does. Where Australia's carved out this niche, I mean, these are companies that survived Trump's first trade war, the COVID pandemic. It's you have to be, if you're going to be a successful advanced manufacturer in Australia, that means you're going to have to export. If you're going to be that in the world market, you've got to already be pretty lean and pretty quick. So we are hopeful that when we see half of them saying we're going to double down on this, we're going to advance that digital agenda. These companies have been through a lot and survived and thrived before.
Yeah, I agree. Now, the concept of grey tape, I think it's a term we've used internally, but I'm glad now we're getting it out into the world. We call it grey tape because red tape is obviously government tape. Green tape, you can imagine sort of environmental approvals, etc. And grey tape is when it's all blended together to become a sort of grey Play-Doh. What I really like about this report, I know people come for the Trump story, but really to me this is the real story and where we can actually have greatest impact. Tell me about the indirect regulatory burdens and how they're affecting Australian businesses' ability to adapt and compete.
Well, so this is the big question we've also had here. And this comes up when AI Group, we go and talk to regulators about new regulations and they say, this regulation's designed, it's going to affect 50 businesses, let's say, in an industry. But the problem is the requirement on the regulated business often says, well, you have to, just like we said with the trade stuff, you need to be able to report information on your suppliers and your customers, which means that regulated business then sends the same form or possibly a different, more complex form out to the rest of its supply chain and say, sorry, you've got to fill this form out now as well. And this is a grey tape concept. So what we ask businesses is, in your regulatory burden, where does it come from? Are you the regulated entity, red tape, or are you the knock-on effect, grey tape? And we found half of business in regulations, the numbers were about half of regulations were that direct on the regulated entity. And in an equal number, about half said, and half the time, where the second order effect is someone else is regulated and they're asking us. Interestingly, when we said, well, that second order effect, what kind of customer? It was typically local customers. So it was more the case that businesses were saying, my other Australian customers who are affected by Australian regulations are knocking onto me. Though there was about a quarter of businesses said it was coming from overseas, and that's often things like the cybersecurity and privacy rules in Europe, so the European General Data Protection Rule. If you sell into Europe, you have to do that. But it was very interesting that says the grey tape effect. It's the first measure, we tried to do this because no one's ever tried to measure it properly, just describe it. But it's the first time we've ever seen any data that says grey tape is just as bad as red tape in terms of the kind of burden, which means for time and business resources, maybe productivity as well. It's a real thing, and it's just as bad as red tape.
And it's so insidious. I mean, speaking to some members who are literally caught in the middle, and that they are regulated, so they're asking for stuff for their suppliers, but they also supply another regulated body, and so therefore, they have to comply to that. And so it's really both ends of the candle, which we know you shouldn't do. Anyway, we better pause there, Jeff, have a break, and then come back and talk about Asian skills.
The largest Australian workplace changes in over a decade
Underpaying
are about to
workers
impact
could
your
result
business.
in crippling fines.
There'll be new rules about when a casual employee
The laws are
has the right
employees will have the right
to disconnect.
Workplace laws are changing. Pay attention or pay the price. Safeguard your business with Australian Industry Group. The legal experts at Australian Industry Group will help you navigate the new legislation and prepare your business for the changes. Become a member today at aigroup.com.au.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Debrief. Now we're going to pivot to a discussion around Asian engagement and skills for Australia's connections with the region. We'll start with Louise on this one first, because, Louise, you've just gotten back from Yogyakarta in Indonesia. You were up there for the kind of annual board meeting for the Australian Consortium for In-Country Indonesian Studies, which it's called ACICIS. The C's in that acronym because in Indonesian, ACICIS. Which is it's a long-standing consortium that has been putting Australian university students into exchanges, study abroad, holiday summer placements in Indonesia for, I think, almost 30 years now, has it? And you're on board. You've just come back, and it's really an opportunity to take up a focus of a discussion regarding kind of those in-market business cultural language skills and how they connect to what Australian business is trying to do with trade.
Yes, Jeff, it was exactly 30 years because we had our celebration in Jogya. So good
I didn't
guessing.
know that, so that was a great guess from me there.
And yes, I sit on the board. Actually, just speaking more broadly about Asian capability, from an Australian industry group point of view, we really commit, just not just the talk, but in person. So I sit on ACHISIS, which, as you said, sends students to Indonesia. Ina sits on the board of AsiaLink, which is more about getting business leaders and businesses into Asia. So this isn't something we're just, talking about lightly. We dedicate our time, which the Stoics will remind us is far more precious than money. And why do we do it? Because we are absolutely committed to helping Australian businesses to engage with the region, to take the opportunities. Many of our members go into Asia as a customer, but also as a supplier, and to make sure that they are maximising the benefits of all that, that they need to have that kind of literacy. This is something that we actually took into the Economic Review Roundtable. I don't think we really got into it in that relevant podcast, but we went in with a clear ask on improving federal funding for Asian language education and improving Asian literacy. And I should just give a shout out to Liam Prince, who is the Executive Director for ACHISIS, and I know a listener of the podcast, because he personally, I think, has driven the conversation on this nationally and has lifted it to a point where we have an inquiry. That there's some wounds, deep wounds in the industry, because this is not the first inquiry, and I'm sure it won't be the last, but it needs to be the most impactful. I mean, the situation now in language learning in Australia is so dire, but particularly for Indonesian. I studied Indonesian at high school in the 80s. I was I think that was the peak. So I was a small country high school in Western Victoria, primarily teaching kids of farmers. We had a full-time Indonesian teacher, and there was also a French teacher. And the situation now in Queensland, where there are only 12 students at university level from first year to honours doing Indonesian, and there are 2 secondary school teachers for the whole state, one in an actual school and the other at the online school. I mean, this show, and I understand the Australian Defence Force, ADFA Academy, has stopped mandating Indonesian learning. They offer it if a officer wants to come and study at ANU, they have that ability, but it's no longer mandated. I mean, our commitment and our funding to languages, full stop, Asian languages second, and then perhaps Indonesian, just for my own Wilbara, is just appalling. And if we are to take advantage of the Moore report, which the government is dedicating millions of dollars to implement, it's all for nothing unless we have people coming up who are at least culturally literate, if not, fluent in the language.
Well, I'm old enough, Louise, I'm old enough to remember the Asian Century white paper from 2012 that said all these things. And at the time, this is in my university days, I was working at Murdoch University. My office was next door to the ACHISIS head office. I'm just going to put in a plug for Indonesian. If you are monolingual and you need to learn a second language for the first time, Indonesian is the best one for an English speaker to learn. It's a modern synthetic language. It has a reduced simplified vocabulary, and it's based on a Germanic system grammar. So it's the same grammar as English. So learning Indonesian has an advantage for language education in Australia. It goes beyond just going to Indonesia. It also helps teach a lot of second language skills that then makes the conversational skills in third and fourth languages become, I think the neurologists say, once you've got a second one in there, your brain's kind of set up for it, right? If you want to wedge a second language into your brain, Indonesian's one of the best ways to do it in Australia. And you can go there really easily.
Yes, and we won't get distracted by how much we both love Yogyakarta. But it is a university town and it's a great place to visit.
Go straight over Bali, go to Jogja. Yeah, fly straight over.
Yeah, it's so much fun. And near Borobudur, which if you ever do study Indonesian, you will do more than one translation on Borobudur, which is a great Hindu site. But anyway, this is a big problem. No one ever objects. Innes reports that in the roundtable when he raised it, he said everyone was like, oh, yes, this is important. The new Colombo Plan is one of the best pieces of government policy that's ever been. We should all do this. it's one of those unfortunate topics that's, yes, we all should do it, we all support it, but it never seems to get done, and it will require money. So one of the things that, was saying we need at least $20 per student annually to support continuous Asian language learning in schools. So we need to restore that funding. It used to be that level. We need to do more to get teachers in. As I said, that the problem in Queensland, for example, even if there was all this money, where would they find the people to teach it? We need to make sure that there is some work integrated learning opportunities. We're working with the team at the CET on how we can provide sort of meaningful suggestions around that, both for domestic students who are thinking about the region. So beyond New Colombo Plan, what can they do within corporations here? And then also, how can we maximise the benefit of all the Asian students coming into Australia? People might be thinking, well, again, AI is surely a solution to this. It will tell us, word for word.
We'll get the Babel fish in your ear. You'll just be able to go around the world and it'll be instantly translated.
That's right. And all those glasses, you can walk around with subtitles.
Don't think of the energy required, Louise. It's if you've ever looked at the net zero on that, there'll be a whole data center for that novelty product for you. Yeah.
Well, I studied Arabic, I studied linguistics at university as well. The linguistics thing, though, is really where it gives you that cultural literacy. I mean, whether people are fluent or not, it is best, but to me, not as essential as understanding, because language drives culture and also the reverse. I've did a couple of weeks studying Japanese when I was in Japan for something. The thing that always sticks with me is they have multiple words for sorry. So in Australia, we say the same word sorry for genocide as for tipping milk. It's just the one word. They have a different expression for, I'm sorry I'm leaving work early. I'm sorry to my customer who I've disappointed. I'm sorry to my parents. I'm sorry, that I've had a car crash. All different says sorry. Now, you don't need to know all those different words of sorry, but it just tells you so much about the culture and how that collective works and how they care about each other and think about each other. So language is a window into the soul of another culture, and that's what we need people to have. So don't get caught up on literacy, on fluency. You start studying, get your kids to start studying. I'm sure you pay for tennis lessons and music lessons and all sorts of things, not expecting them to be in the National Orchestra or at Wimbledon. We do have to do these things just because it's good to do, not because it's going to lead to a job. But of course, it will lead to a job, because if companies are going to, as I said, maximise the benefits of the Moore Report and the opportunity of the Asian next century, they need to understand how people communicate and what meaning is behind different words.
Well, it also lets us Australia take charge of that rather than being a kind of taker of these things, because Australia as a Western country is actually pretty good on Asian languages in the population, but it's fully migration dependent. So when you're looking for professionals that can speak Asian languages, in Australia, you're by and large hiring a migrant who's a native speaker who's migrated to Australia, or they might be second gen. So I learned it at home from mum and dad who came from the particular country. And so that means, if you look at rates in the Australian population, we've got pretty good coverage. Australia's kind of cultural and political interests, our commercial interests and our migration flows all have their own separate logics. So one of the reasons I think we're deficient in Indonesian is because there isn't a big flow of Indonesians coming to Australia compared to other countries, for example. So if we rely on the migration program to solve our language capability skills, we'll end up lousy in Hindi and Mandarin Chinese and having nothing on Bahasa Indonesia and a Japanese speaking population that's getting older and probably moving out of the workforce. And so it's really, this is what it's a question as to does Australia want to think strategically about how we invest in language capability, or just leave it up to whoever rocks up to the migration program to determine what language capability we've got. And so this is where I think there's a strategic economic view on this about thinking about Indonesia's a good example, but there's some other markets too. I wouldn't want to pick on one language where we're not going to have the migration flow to sustain that unless governments and business make a decision that we need this language. We can't rely on migration system. We're going to have to make an investment. We're going to have to teach Australians to speak it as a second language in our country initially, which means high school.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think the problem is it's been treated as a community problem and a community, so it's focused on community languages. There's no strategy coming from the top, and just relying on. I mean, even relying on community languages, often second generation people miss out for all sorts of complex reasons. And again, AI is not the solution. And this is one of my favourite stories from Bob Hawke when he went to China, and he had a human translating for him, not AI, but AI I'm sure would make the same mistake. And at one point, Hawke said to the Chinese leader, "Stop playing funny buggers with me." And that was politely translated as "stop playing homosexual games with me." And it just shows language, context is everything. And that's what we need people to understand.
Especially when you're speaking Australian English, which is heavily idiomatic. And it's the only country in the world you can say funny buggers in the way Prime Minister Hawke meant it in that context.
Anyway, that's all we've got time for. Links to our submission and our report will be in the show notes. If you found this podcast via the AI Group website, please subscribe on your usual podcast platform so you don't miss an episode. And if that platform lets you leave a review, please take a time to leave one. I'm Louise McGrath, and I'm joined by Jeff Wilson. And if you have any comments or questions, please email industry.policy@aigroup.com.au, and we'll speak in a couple of weeks.